Hi, I'm Martyn Drake, and this is a Profit on Purpose interview with Petra Ingram, Chief Executive of Brooke. Hello, Petra.
Hi, Martyn.
Thank you very much for joining us. Well, actually, I should thank you in particular for this. A few months ago, you and I ran 3 days of fantastic workshops together with your international team from all over the world. And at the end of it, you very, very kindly gave me this book, all about Dorothy Brooke and the foundation of your charity. Do you want to just share that story?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Dorothy Brooke was a really inspirational lady from which the Brooke took its name. But she started the charity 81 years ago when she travelled to Cairo in Egypt with her husband. And at the same time, there was a lot of talk about animal welfare in the UK. And she went to Cairo knowing that there were old war horses that had been left in Cairo after the First World War. And so she set about on a mission of trying to find some of those old war horses. And she managed to locate around 5,000 of them. And if you can imagine, in 1934, some years after the end of the First World War, they were in pretty poor condition. So she rescued those horses and set up the Old War Horse Memorial Hospital, which became the Brooke Hospital in Cairo. And from those very small beginnings, we're now a charity working in 11 countries across the world, helping almost 2 million working equine animals a year and the families and people that depend on those animals for their livelihoods.
And a lot of that growth has been relatively recent, I mean, certainly in terms of turnover, hasn't it?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think in the last 10 years we've gone from around £4 million of income up to around £18 million of income, and a lot of that growth in the last 5 years. So we've changed significantly as an organisation in that time.
What would you say are the biggest specific changes that have happened to the organisation over that period?
I think programmatically we've moved from providing primarily treatments to animals through a network of vets across the countries that we work in, to thinking about our work in a more sustainable way. So looking holistically at the environments that we're working in and how can we improve welfare for the animals today and also in the longer term. So working with the communities, working with the service providers, working at a district, national and international level with our advocacy to change the environments and to increase the recognition of the importance of working equine animals on the livelihoods of people.
So that's a much more complex message than simply going and sending a vet in and mending an animal. How do you find translating that message to some of your stakeholders, your trustees, your staff, your donors in particular?
For the Brooke, quite simply, there's 100 million working equine animals across the world. Many of those animals suffer welfare problems, many suffer unnecessarily, and we want to change that. And I think it's pivotal for us is the change that we want to bring about. And that's where the organisation has really moved forward over the last 5 years, from providing activities, from just doing stuff, to thinking about making change. And we use a model called theory of change to help us understand the kind of change that we're trying to bring about.
The theory of change, we've spoken about this before, but just briefly, what does that look like and how did you come to develop it?
Well, the theory of change is kind of a process that you go through to look at what you're trying to achieve in terms of delivering your charitable objectives. It's a kind of a framework that you can really prove that the work that you do, the activities that you do, are actually bringing about long-term change. And it's made up of a set of assumptions, and once you're clear about that, it underpins your strategy.
I remember when we did your strategy process together, you were very clear, particularly as we went through the process, about how important it was to get the theory of change in there, into the heart of your strategy. And I guess a year on now, it's still quite early days, but how would you say that that's gone, and what impact do you think that decision has had?
I think it's really fundamental to some of our thinking in terms of how we implement the strategy. So the strategy, like all strategies, consists of a mission, a couple of goals and some priorities. And as we look at making decisions in terms of what is important within those priorities, we're concentrating on our theory of change. So for example, one of our priorities around building capacity locally to bring about change, whether that capacity is within communities, the horse owners, the horse handlers, or within the service providers. You know, those are the people that we're trying to change their behaviour. So the two are very integrated. The strategy sits as a framework around the theory of change and informs our decision making.
So I know your organisation is a very scientific one. You've got lots of vets and people with a very scientific background, and evidence for them is really key. So when your theory of change talks about activities that you do, behavioural change, environmental change, that then relates to sustainable change in an animal's condition, how do you go about creating any sort of evidence base that actually validates those assumptions?
But we always start with the animal, so we'll look at the indicators on the animal in terms of its welfare condition. But we all know that the animal can't improve its welfare on its own, and it's dependent on the people that surround it. So we have a framework of indicators around the behaviours of the people in different categories. So we'll be looking at communities, we'll be looking at service providers, we'll be looking at people involved in advocacy, and look at how we want their behaviour to change and what are the indicators that we're measuring around their behaviour. And how we motivate them, how we stimulate them to change their behaviour. And motivation can be all sorts of things, but getting into that kind of degree of detail, which is where you start unpicking the complexity of it, is done in the framework of the theory of change.
And you mentioned you started doing this around 5 years ago, so is the theory now complete, or is this still an ongoing journey?
I think any theory of change is a journey for an organisation, and I think that we're still very early on in that journey because we're going through the process of proving that our theory of change is robust for what we're doing. And when you're trying to make change, it's not a short-term activity. It often takes many years to see that change. But beginning to exit now our work from areas, and as we exit from areas, we can actually monitor the welfare improvements that we've made on the animals and ensure that they are sustained over a period of several years. And we can gradually reduce the monitoring that we're doing. So we're really proving now that our model is working, and that will, I think, then underpin what we go on to do in the future.
From your experience then over the last 5 years of developing this and putting it into practice, what are your learnings? What would you share with people who are looking at embarking on this journey?
I think it's really important to have a vision in terms of where you're going as an organisation. I think that's fundamental as a leader, but it's also really fundamental in terms of taking the organisation into a place of looking at change. I think that you need to recognise that there's a kind of a cultural change as well that's needed, and I think the theory of change can be quite a good stimulator, facilitator for everyone to be really engaging in what the organisation's doing. And so, for example, our overseas countries used to just submit activity reports at the end of each year. How many treatments had they done? How many people had they trained? Over the last 2 years, we've actually moved them thinking about the kind of the so what question. So what is happening as a result of that? And I think more and more charities are looking at what are the outcomes of their work. And I think the theory of change helps you understand the importance of measuring those outcomes and ultimately the impact that you're having. I think theory of change unpicks the complexity within a simple framework, and I think that enables you to therefore communicate really clearly to your management, to your staff, to your trustees, to your stakeholders, your supporters, exactly what the charity is all about. So I think it does inform your communication and ensures that everybody has a consistent understanding of what you're trying to do as a charity. And I think that's really important in the successful implementation of any strategy.
Going forwards, next 5-10 years, how influential do you think it's going to be on the future shape and look and feel of the organisation?
I think for the Brooke, it's fundamental. I think it underpins what we're doing, and I hope it will underpin our future success. I think the sector more widely has been using theory of change, particularly in international development, for a number of years. And you can go onto Google and you can search and you can find a number of really interesting articles linked with DFID or Comic Relief. But I think the sector has been moving from kind of activity-based work into trying to bring about change, and I think that applies to UK domestic charities as well as international charities. And I think there's a wide opportunity for other organisations to pick up on the theory and use it to underpin thinking and their own decision making in the same way that the Brooke has done that.
Thank you very much, Petra. That's been really helpful.
You're very welcome, Martyn.